Okay, well, welcome everybody to the Future of Our Oceans webinar brought to you by Oceans at Duke. I'm John Verdon. I lead the Ocean Policy Research Program at Duke's Nicholas Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Now, for those of you who don't know, Oceans at Duke is an interdisciplinary network of faculty and scholars at Duke working on the key ocean sustainability challenges of our time. We're working across Duke's campus to apply cutting edge insights from ocean science, governance, and business to tackle the ocean's most urgent challenges and problems. So I want to thank you for joining us to this webinar series. We've been at this now since the start of 2021, and we've been exploring a range of key sustainability challenges from large marine conservation areas and their future, the role of oceans in humans' health, drivers and risk of deep sea mining, solutions to ocean and plastic pollution, and others. And we try and highlight the research from Duke University researchers while also engaging other experts and stakeholders connected to these challenges. And so our purpose really is to inform and inspire and enable you to help ocean ecosystems and communities flourish for the long term. So today is the first webinar in our series for the new academic year, and we have a great talk today to kick it off on rebuilding marine ecosystems in the Anthropocene. So let me first just give you a quick guidelines for the session. It'll be 60 minutes today, our session, including our speakers' presentations and some times for question and answer for the last 10 minutes. Now, your cameras and microphones are not turned on or functional for the session, but we do encourage you to share questions and comments in the Q&A box there, which is monitored by our team. And then we also, of course, encourage you to go to the Oceans at Duke website, linked to your registration, where you can see additional articles and resources related to the topic here. And then today's webinar will also be recorded and posted to that website later this week. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Brian Silliman. Brian's the Rachel Carson Distinguished Professor of Marine Conservation Biology at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment, where his teaching and research are focused on community ecology, conservation and restoration, global change, plant and animal interactions, and evolution and ecological consequences of cooperative behavior, and where he leads Duke's Restore initiative. So now I'll hand it over to Brian to kick us off with thanks.
Thank you, John, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here today, starting up my talk. And I want to thank everybody at Duke at Oceans for starting this initiative and for this beginning the seminar series. I think it's been great so far, and hopefully we can add to that. We'll be talking today about the rapidly emerging tool in the marine conservation tool chest, that is marine ecosystem restoration. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that the research we're going to present today is due to a large collaboration among a lot of individuals, from undergrads to postdocs to research scientists, and this is a growing community as well. We'd also like to acknowledge our funders, the LINFEST Ocean Program, Oak Foundation, NSOE Venture Fund, and Brad and Shelley Stanbeck for their belief in some of the, I would say, risky ideas that we're putting forward to try to innovate in this field. I'd like to start off with a punchline too, and thinking about what the conclusions are going to be, so you can think about those throughout. One is that to meet this sort of rising global expectation for restoration, we have to innovate, because restoration is in many ways in the Middle Ages. And one way we can do that, and Stephanie Valdez will talk about that, is harnessing biological partnerships and designs. Another way is to think about taking advantage of this untapped opportunity to inject nature into mixed communities, nature and humans. And lastly, we'll talk about the importance of inclusivity as key to the success, intellectual, people-wise, and perspectives and stakeholders in that. About 30 years ago, E.O. Wilson predicted that we'd be here in 1992. He said, the next century, I believe, will be the era of restoration. For the first 20 years or so, that really didn't come to fruition. There wasn't a rise and increase in restoration, either in the academic or in the global community. And the huge uptick in the last 10 years has not come from the academic community, it's come from the global community. And they there's been an increased demand and interest in whether or not we can use restoration as a tool to bring back more nature. An example of that is in the Sustainable Development Goals of 2014, and over half of them, a key component to reaching those goals is actually putting back and increasing the amount of nature and the services it provides to humans. And because they said we need to do this through conservation as well as restoration. In accordance with these goals and other movements across the world, nations have responded. For instance, China has said that it will put back half of the mangroves that's destroyed, which is a massive area, 18,000 acres they're going to put back by 2030, 2035. And the UN recently declared the decade that we're in now as the decade of ecosystem restoration. So this is the global community outpacing the academic community. And so, but why restoration? Why now? Well, we clearly need more nature, not just conserve what we have, but we need more of it back. And the measures that we've used in the past that bring back nature to generate services for humans and to increase biodiversity aren't working so well. And in fact, most conservation biologists would suggest that we're just slowing the decline. 3 of those methods in marine systems were mitigating pollution, establishing protected areas, managing human behavior, and managing harvest from those areas. But if you look at habitat coverage over this last 50 or 60 years as marine conservation increased, what we see is there's been a general decline in these systems, not even a stabilization. For instance, in coral reefs, in this graph that you see here, gone from an average of 50% cover to down to 10 to 15% on the many reefs. Oyster reefs have been hit the hardest with a 90% decline and 30 to 60% loss in other habitats. So can restoration come to the rescue and answer this call from the global community? Well, if you look at this, talk to a lot of scientists, there's quite a bit of doubt about whether or not we have the technology to know how to do this at scale. If you synthesize our successes so far, the averages don't look too good. Firstly, the track record tells us that most of the restoration projects have been small in scale. They've been super expensive when money is limiting in conservation, and they're prone to failure. And this suggests that maybe it's something we're overly optimistic. But I did mention at the beginning that it's an emerging field. And when I think of an emerging field, I think of potential. And I think of restoration as sort of just below the major leagues and really a minor league player in many ways with a great fastball that needs a lot of help in trying to control that fastball and its efficiency. And so how can we innovate quickly in restoration to answer the call? And the one way you look at emerging fields is you don't evaluate success based on averages. You need to look for bright spots. And so the first step we did is we did this systematic review of the literature, more of a qualitative, and said, let's look at the hot spots, the outliers, the bright spots of where things are working. And we found a lot of examples of where restoration can be successful at scale, it can be cheap, and it can really last for a long period of time. For example, very close to here in Virginia, just a 3 or 4 hours drive, is the largest restored seagrass system in the world. This happens off the coast of Virginia. And about 20 years ago, a few scientists from Virginia Institute of Marine Scientists, they decided this system wasn't as polluted as everybody said. It was pretty clear, and they thought it could be recruitment limited rather than pollution limited. And so they went out there against the paradigm and threw a bunch of seeds out there to see what would happen. 20 years later, those seeds have taken off, and there's over 1,800 acres of salt marsh that's growing at 5 to 10% of seagrass, that's growing at 5 to 10% of it. An amazing story. How many other places like this are in the world that are recruitment limited we could take advantage of? So not only did we do that bright spot analysis over the past couple of years to answer this call from the global community about whether or not restoration can innovate and be a major in the major leagues in the conservation tool chest, is we formed Duke Restore. And this is a university initiative here focused on creatively rebuilding habitats to help nature and people. And when we started this, we wanted to do a non-typical academic institution, not sort of a top-down pyramid, a director. We wanted to be more like an NGO, be nimble, and form teams with university students, faculty, and those teams would also be partnered with NGOs, government organizations like the Department of Defense, and other entities that are interested in conserving systems and bringing them back to restoration. So example, we have 3 teams that are going to speak today about their research that's just beginning, and some of it's been successful and stuff that's going to be in the future. And those 3 teams are going to be the Reef team, the Seagrass team, and the Living Shorelines team. And today our first speaker is going to be Stephanie Valdez. She will talk about the Seagrass team and talk about biological partnerships and how injecting them into the designs of restoration can help out. And then we'll move on to the Living Shoreline team with Dr. Carter Smith. And then Dr. Avery Paxton, who's a visiting scholar with Duke Restore, who is a scientist with NOAA, will talk to us about novel marine ecosystems. These are 3 ways that we think there could be major innovation and 3 opportunities, and just 3 though. We think that the changes here can really make a big difference, but there's a lot more opportunities from this than just these 3, and we like to discuss that with you at the end. So I'm going to stop now and introduce our first speaker. That will be Stephanie Valdez, who is a PhD student in the Nicholas School of the Environment. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Washington and worked in the seagrass lab there. And she is down at the Duke Marine Lab investigating trophic effects in seagrass systems. And she'll talk to us today about mutualisms in restoration. Take it away.
Thanks, Brian. And hello, everyone. Like Brian mentioned, I will be talking about ecological partnerships in restoration and how we can move forward with them. So ecological partnerships are very common in nature, from behaviors such as bird flocking and fish schooling to between organisms. And those of you who are familiar with gardening may have heard of the 3 sisters, corn, squash, and beans, and how they facilitate productive growth through our growing season. However, the current paradigm in restoration is to increase productivity by limiting negative interactions. And this can take the form of planting arrangements, as we see over here with these perfectly evenly spaced trees, avoiding interactions with our neighbors, basically. It could also be limiting our scope to single organisms. So rather than having organisms share space and potentially utilize similar resources, we separate them out and focus on single organisms, our target species, if you will. However, this isn't always, like, this works in certain situations, but this is not conducive to every system and every situation. So I'll be talking about 3 examples of positive interactions in restoration, knowing that there are a lot more out there, as well as much more in these 3 categories. So to start, I'll talk about some intraspecific interactions, those between individuals in a population. Moving next to interspecific interactions, direct interactions between different species in a system. And then trophic interactions, how our top predators change the food web below them. And theory suggests that these positive interactions will be extremely powerful in more stressful environments. So here we can see a beautiful reef with lots of fish. And in this case, fish are actually facilitating growth by cleaning off macroalgae and corals. And they're working together to create this beautiful system. However, when one or the other is lost and we become off balanced, we end up with a low coral diversity and fish diversity system, which is much more prone to risk of disturbance. All right, so when we have our intraspecific, again, individuals within the same population interacting with each other. Research has shown that in kelp, verifying or diversifying the age structure that we outplant, so looking at individuals like the young of year as well as our adult plants, adults actually help facilitate those young, and they can help the restoration success as we move forward. Additionally, one that we've spent some fair time on is planting arrangement. So as I mentioned, under stressful environments, this planting arrangement could be very useful, as we see in this diagram over here. In practice, this basically looks like clumped versus dispersed planting. So again, we have those evenly spaced plants that are avoiding interactions with their neighbors. And then here we have them clumped, where our individuals of the same biomass, so it's the same number of individuals, moved together. And this has been shown to help for, again, when those environments are stressful. So wave attenuation, desiccation stress, things like that in marshes and seagrasses. And now moving into our interspecific, interactions. These are our mutualisms, our commensalisms, and our facilitation cascades. So these ones have been fairly well documented throughout the literature and have been for decades. But now we're just getting to the point where we can start, or we are starting to incorporate them into restoration design. So for example, salt marshes and mussels are a now very well documented facilitation cascade. And when our marsh plants are planted with mussels, we see increased resiliency as well as larger expansion of the plants. Similarly with coral and sponges. So when corals are restored in just a rubble pile to accumulate live polyps, we see much more when we have sponges involved that help facilitate and protect these young polyps. Finally, seagrass and clams. Again, this one has been somewhat well documented. Clams are a filter feeder. They improve water clarity. Seagrass is a very light hungry group. So basically the idea of implanting clams into our seagrass restoration is thought to increase it. And there's actually some recent research from Zhang et al. 2021 that kind of shows this very promisingly. So we have these beautiful pictures, but then we also have this panel of graphs below. And on our y-axis, we have our important metrics of change for seagrass. So we have change in area, below ground biomass, and nitrogen. And then on our x, we have our treatment. So seeds alone, and then seeds with clams. And in all three of these cases, we can see that the clam addition significantly helps the growth and expansion of seagrass. All right, so then we have our trophic interactions. So again, our top-down predators and how they influence the food webs below them. And this can take several different forms. So in this diagram over here, we have a 4-level trophic facilitation mitigated, or at the top, we have our otters, and through a secondary and a primary consumer, we have changes to epiphyte loads on seagrass that then impact the seagrass itself. More directly, we have 2-level facilitation trophic cascades where top predators like sharks directly eat consumers of seagrass. And then we see a similar growth and production rate increase. And this one, for example, has been documented in Elkhorn Slough, California, where we have on our y-axis eelgrass cover, which is a type of seagrass, nitrates, and otter densities. And we can see that otter densities and seagrass are highly coupled. And even the increase of nitrates through the system well beyond what was thought to be a limiting factor for seagrass shows that seagrass can actually expand past that and live past that if the appropriate trophic structure is in place. And all this to say, to look at systems as a whole and look at where our top predators are, and if restoring them coupled with a foundation species or an individual target species could be viable. And then, as Brian mentioned, I am leading a team for Duke Restore with the Seagrass Farm. So our goal is really to build off of these restoration successes. Again, these are small scale experiments and experimental restorations that need to be tried on a larger scale, as well as developing some of these approaches and making it economically viable. So how do we get this to be big scale, and how do we improve our restoration across economic availabilities? And a big thing facing restoration, seagrass restoration, is the lack of material out there for seagrass restoration. So we don't have sod, we don't have seed in a central location to give to people that want to restore their seagrass beds like we have for marshes. So creating this space where we can collaboratively work with universities, NGOs, and government agencies to build this seed and sod refuge. We're currently in the works of building partnerships with the University of Chapel Hill, or University of Carolina, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Pew, and Coastal Federation. And then finally, where do we go with this information? Again, the major takeaway is how layering these positive species interactions to restoration frameworks in place can be extremely powerful with very little extra input. And then moving forward, how do these interactions layer? So Dr. Smith, who you'll hear from next, has started this. She's talking about something different, but she has started this briefly looking at how planting arrangements and mutualisms can change the restoration strategy, and whether these effects are just additive or possibly synergistic. And with that, here are some references just for folks if they want more information on different types of positive interactions or more in-depth on the ones that I covered today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And then our next speaker is going to be Dr. Carter Smith, and she received her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and started as a postdoctoral scholar at the Duke Marine Lab and with Duke Restore about 2 years ago, and now she is the scientific lead for the Duke Restore team Living Shoreline. So take it away, Carter.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm excited to talk about how we can think more creatively about restoration using hybrid restoration strategies to enhance coastal resilience and sustainability. So the traditional paradigm of restoration is to put nature back in its most pristine form. But for a variety of reasons, this paradigm really confines us. For example, as you can see from this graphic on this slide, we live in a very urbanized world, especially along coastlines. And urbanization and restoration in its most traditional form are often at odds, because when you are in areas with high human densities, there are a lot of conflicting land use priorities, and you might simply lack the space to restore large swaths of habitat. And so if we're going to expand restoration to every corner of the globe to try and meet our global restoration targets, we need to be thinking more creatively about how to combine restoration with infrastructure so that we can develop on multiple human priorities. And so there are a variety of different forms that hybrid restoration can take across terrestrial and marine ecosystems, but I'm going to focus in on one coastal example. And to start, I want to talk about the problem. So shoreline hardening is a ubiquitous practice that's been used all over the globe for millennia, and it involves the placement of some kind of hard fixed structure right at the land-water interface for the purposes of keeping the shoreline in a fixed position, reducing erosion, or protecting against storm damage or flood damage. And shoreline hardening comes in many different shapes and forms, from seawalls to riprap revetments and bulkheads, but it's a pretty significant problem. So here in the US, over 14% of the US sheltered coastline is already hardened, and this number's rapidly growing. In other areas of the world, this number's approaching 100% of the shoreline, especially in urbanized areas. And shoreline hardening is potentially problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, it quite literally cuts off that connection between the land and sea, which can create a physical barrier to movement for some organisms. And accordingly, we see much lower biodiversity along these shorelines versus natural reference shorelines. Similarly, hardened shorelines can impact the sustainability of coastal habitats that are seaward of them, like salt marshes and oyster reefs and seagrass beds, especially in the context of climate change and sea level rise. Typically, with rising sea levels, intertidal habitats would slowly migrate upslope. But if there's a fixed wall that's preventing those habitats from migrating upslope, they're eventually going to be squeezed out and lost. And then from more of a socioeconomic perspective, these walls are really expensive to build. They're frequently damaged, so they're quite expensive to maintain. And they're built with a fixed sea level in mind, which means that going forward under elevated scenarios of sea level rise, we're going to have to make major investments in repairing and retrofitting these structures. And so you may be wondering, if shoreline hardening is so bad, why do we continue to do this practice? And that's something we've been really interested in. And so we've done a lot of survey work in North Carolina, and some collaborators have done similar work in the Gulf Coast and the Northeast to really understand, what do coastal residents prioritize when choosing how to stabilize their shorelines. And what we've found pretty consistently across all of these locations is that coastal residents prioritize effectiveness at actually reducing erosion or protecting their property. They prioritize cost and durability. And the ecological impact of these structures is a pretty distant fourth. And so what this tells us is, if we want to market hybrid restoration alternatives to traditional infrastructure, we need to be able to demonstrate first that they're effective, they're costly, and they're durable. And so that brings us to living shorelines. Living shorelines use plants or other natural elements, sometimes in combination with harder shoreline structures, to stabilize estuarine coasts, bays, and tributaries. And I want to draw your attention to something really important here, which is that the primary purpose of living shorelines is to provide this coastal protective service. And so this is a pretty big departure from what we think of as traditional restoration, where typically you're restoring for biodiversity enhancement or natural heritage values. And so living shorelines is really an umbrella term that covers a variety of different restoration techniques for shoreline protection. So on the greenest end, you could purely be restoring salt marshes or mangroves to help to stabilize the sediments and protect the shoreline. Or on the gray end, we have much more highly engineered structures that combine gray infrastructure with habitat restoration. And so as an example, this is a very common strategy we use in the US. It's combining some type of offshore breakwater or sill made from granite or concrete or recycled oyster shell. And then there's some kind of restored vegetative habitat behind these structures. And so living shorelines have the potential to be preferable to hardened shorelines for a number of reasons. First of all, as you can see in this photograph here, there are gaps in the breakwater that allow animals to move freely throughout this intertidal zone. So we no longer have that physical barrier to movement. And accordingly, we see quite high biodiversity at these sites. And we've even recorded higher abundances of juvenile fish and crustaceans at living shoreline sites versus natural reference marshes. So they could be serving a really important nursery habitat role. And then additionally, by using these more hybrid structures that have this gray component, we're getting additional wave protection ability over just restoring that salt marsh alone. And then perhaps most interestingly, because these habitats are made up of living components, they have the capability to sort of adapt and self-maintain and grow on their own without continued human intervention. And so they can grow vertically or accrete vertically under accelerated rates of sea level rise without having humans need to come back in and fix them. However, we know from our survey work that all of these ecological benefits are great, but people want to know if these structures really work at protecting their properties. And so with that in mind, we initiated a large-scale observational field survey in North Carolina back in 2016, where we picked several regions across North Carolina. And in each region, we had a matching natural marsh. In green, we had a living shoreline with a rock sill in gray, and we compared those to a traditional bulkhead in black. And we followed these sites for 2 years and looked at how the elevation and vegetation profiles of the sites changed, especially from right before to right after a Category 1 hurricane. And so this figure really sums up some of the major findings of our work. So this is looking at the change in landward elevation behind each of these shorelines from right before to right after Hurricane Matthew. And so what we saw was that all of our marshes and all of our bulkheads lost landward elevation from before to after the storm, whereas the living shorelines we studied roughly maintained elevation. So they did a superior job of resisting landward erosion during the storm. And perhaps even more interestingly, none of the living shorelines in our study had any obvious visual damage to them from the storm, whereas 75% of the bulkheads in our study had obvious visual damage that was going to require a contractor to come in or a landscaper to come in and fix it. And so to sort of back that up with another photographic anecdote, this is a photo series of a living shoreline in the top. So this is a newly constructed granite living shoreline in the top photograph. And down below, we have an aging concrete bulkhead. And these two sites are only separated by about 100 feet of shoreline. And so these photographs were taken, I think, a couple of months before Hurricane Irene. And then these photographs were taken a few days past Hurricane Irene, which was another Category 1 hurricane. And you can see that the living shoreline on the top is still looking great, whereas the bulkhead on the bottom has been completely ripped off of the shoreline. There's been really rapid and massive sediment erosion behind that shoreline, and it cost the homeowners about $20,000 out of pocket to replace this shoreline. And so at Duke Restore, we are really excited about the potential for living shorelines, and I'm heading up a living shorelines team. And we're particularly excited about this new partnership with the United States Marine Corps, who's about to initiate one of the largest living shoreline construction projects in the country. They're restoring about 2 miles of shoreline along the Neuse River estuary. And so we're going to be working with them over the next 5 years to help design the ecological components of this shoreline and also assess the benefits to the base and the surrounding environment and surrounding community of choosing this living shoreline strategy over just a pure hardened shoreline strategy. And so just some take-home points here. Living shorelines and other hybrid restoration techniques have the potential to simultaneously meet both human and environmental needs. And I'm at least a firm believer that if we're to meet global restoration goals and targets, hybrid restoration strategies will be a necessary component of future restoration plans. And from there, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Carter. I think even in science, people can see that good pictures are worth 1,000 words. Pretty amazing to see those effects. So our next speaker will be Dr. Avery Paxton, who received her PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She was a postdoctoral scholar at Duke University for approximately 2 years. And now she is a scientist with NOAA, fishery scientist, and a visiting scholar with Duke Restore. Thank you, Avery.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everybody. I am really excited to continue this discussion, but take it in a little bit different trajectory. So while Stephanie has focused on ecological partnerships and Carter has focused on hybrid restoration, I'm going to take us in a bit different direction and focus on how novel human-made structures in marine environments might be tools for restoration. And let's see if the slides will go. They're thinking about it. There we go. So I want to frame this, and this is a common thread that you've heard throughout today's presentation with terrestrial ecosystems. And this is a global map that shows the human influence on ecosystems. And you can see that the brighter and warmer reds and purples, as well as the blacks, those indicate high areas of a human footprint. And in a lot of these areas with a high human footprint, what we tend to get is systems that are less wild and less natural than they once were. And in many cases, this can lead to the introduction, like Carter has talked about on shorelines, of novel habitats. And what I want to look at now is how this translates to the ocean and coastal environment. And just like Carter has shared, this is kind of the inverse map of what we looked at, where we have in the warmer colors like the reds, the cumulative human impact. So again, areas of increased human pressure on the environment. And a lot of this occurs in areas of the coastal ocean. And one of the ways that this can manifest is in the increased siting and installation of novel artificial structures in our coastal environment. And while this can include structures like bulkheads that Carter has talked about, what I want to focus on is how in some of the deeper waters, this can include structures like wind turbines who are extracting renewable energy resources from the environment. These structures can also be those used to extract oil and gas resources, and they can be those used to produce food from aquaculture efforts. One of my favorite examples is this aerial image from Dubai, where we have man-made, human-made islands that you can see here that are constructed with these interesting geometric patterns. And what I want to focus on today is a case study that involves artificial reefs. And artificial reefs are structures that are intentionally deployed, oftentimes in the United States by state managers, but this is a global practice. And these structures come in many different shapes and sizes. A few of them are shown here, such as a ship. These structures are cleaned and then intentionally scuttled or sunk. In some cases, there are purposely designed modules, such as these ones that are a dome shape, and they have holes in them to support fish and other critters of varying size classes. And then in other cases, we have materials that were once used for a different purpose, like these concrete pipes that are then repurposed and used as reef material. And why are folks installing these reefs underwater? Well, there's a multitude of goals that managers aim to achieve when they sink artificial reefs. One of them is to provide fishing and diving sites. Another is to simply enhance habitat, but these can also be used as tools for fisheries management. And in some cases, they can be used as mitigation for other environmental impacts. And what I want to stress today is that artificial reefs can often be and are claimed to be tools for restoration. And so I work as a contractor for CSS Inc. for the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science within NOAA. And within the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, one of the things that we aim to do is conduct science to support management decisions. And for this artificial reef case study that we're highlighting today, our group is trying to conduct science that'll inform decisions about planning and siting and managing artificial reefs across the seascape. And so one of the key questions that we need to answer in order to understand whether artificial reefs can function as restoration tools is how do these structures ecologically function? And in our case, we're zeroing in on fish habitat. And so to answer this, we take a comparative approach where we compare the ecological services and roles provided by artificial reefs, shown here on the left, with those of naturally occurring reefs, like this rocky reef. Other examples could be coral reefs as well. And our team uses a variety of approaches to get at this question. Sometimes we use remotely operated vehicles or human-occupied submersibles. We oftentimes use sound that is emitted from fishery echo sounders to map the fish communities and the seafloor and its structures. But what I'm going to share today is how our team has used diving surveys on multiple natural and artificial reefs off the Southeast United States over a several-year period to uncover some really interesting ecological functions. The first of these is that our team found through our diving surveys that these artificial reefs can facilitate tropical and subtropical fish. And this is off the coast of North Carolina, which is a biogeographic transition zone where the subtropical and tropical fish, like this angelfish that you see here, are at the edge of their climate ranges. And what we found is that when we compared the number of tropical fish, shown here on the y-axis, on artificial and natural reefs, we didn't see much of a difference in tropical fish abundance on the shallow and intermediate depth reefs. But when we looked closer to the 30 to 40 meter depth range, these deep reefs, we saw a marked difference where there were more tropical fish on the artificial structures than the natural. And we saw this same pattern play out for subtropical fish, again, with heightened abundances on these artificial deep reefs. And so because of this, we wanted to understand whether other functional groups of fish might have similar patterns of preference for one reef type over another. And so the next thing we looked at was large reef-associated predators. These include fish like barracuda, they include jack, so big, fast-swimming fish, oftentimes sharks as well. And what we determined is that on artificial reefs, these water column-associated predators were much more prevalent on the artificial compared to the natural reefs. And when we dug a bit deeper, we determined that the likely mechanism that underlies this pattern is that these artificial reefs are introducing structures that are very tall. So looking at the x-axis here of vertical relief. And what we found is that with artificial reef height, as it increased, so did the number of transient predators. And so what I'm showing you here is that we're starting to weave this tale of how artificial reefs can provide novel ecological functions that sometimes differ from their natural counterparts. And for the shark part of this story, we found that the sharks are oftentimes much more prevalent on the artificial reefs compared to their natural counterparts. And one of the interesting things that this related to was the variety of reef fish also present. So on these novel habitats, when sharks were present, there was oftentimes a higher variety of reef fish around them. And so I want to now take you to a little bit different part of the ecosystem. We've been focusing on relatively shallow reefs that are about 40 meters deep maximum. And now I want to take you to a selection of deep artificial reefs off the southeast United States coast. This one that we're looking at here is a German U-boat, a submarine that sank during World War II. It rests in about 800 feet of water. And our team used remote human-occupied vehicles or submersibles to get eyes on this shipwreck and a neighboring Nicaraguan freighter for the first time since they had been sunk in 1942. And one of the things that we found on these two shipwrecks, as well as nearby ones in similar depth ranges, is that these tiny little islands of novel artificial structure on the seafloor formed hotspots for large fish like grouper that you're seeing here. These are snowy grouper and Warsaw grouper, very important fish species, group of fish species. And so today what I've shared with you are brief snippets, little highlights of how some of these artificial structures can function. And what our team is trying to do is we're trying to scale this up. So we know that these novel habitats can provide ecological services, but how do they really function when we look at a broader scale across a seascape? And this is one example. If we look at an artificial reef, in this case, a shipwreck, which you're seeing here, you can see some of the boiler structures. We're kind of looking at a side-on 3D view. And I've plotted here in teal the locations of fish that are around this particular wreck. The bigger dots equal bigger fish, whereas the smaller dots are smaller fish. And so we're trying to take this broader seascape approach and understand how can we maximize the benefits of installing these structures on the seafloor. And so what I want to leave you with, this is a confusing diagram, but I'm going to break it down, is that what we can do is we can harness artificial structures that we're going to be installing, whether it's a structure that will be used to extract wind energy, whether it's an artificial reef, as in this case study. And if we strategically introduce those novel habitats into the marine environment, it's possible that they can fulfill ecological roles that can help generate positive restoration effects. And so what I'd propose is that we use the marine spatial planning construct, where we deconflict different human uses of the coastal ocean, incorporating these artificial habitats, focusing not only on the societal and economic relationships, but also on the ecology. And we can do that by rigorously siting artificial reefs according to the most up-to-date science. We can design and construct them to have the ecological goals that we want be hopefully appropriately met by those design and construction decisions. And then we can conduct ecological evaluations, including hypothesis-driven research, monitoring, and then focus all of this back into an adaptive management framework. And so what I'll leave you with is a question that I don't fully know the answer to, but it's something I would pose, is that we should think seriously and strongly about how we can harness some of these novel human-made artificial habitats for restoration. They may provide us with an interesting path forward for restoration in a human-altered seascape, but before we do this in a widespread manner, we still need to uncover a lot about how these structures really do function ecologically. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Brian to wrap us up.
Thanks so much, Avery. That was a great talk. A lot to think about that and really interesting results. I'm going to finish up here with conclusions and some thoughts that can potentially generate some questions and discussion afterwards. If you have any questions, please post those in the chat and we will get right to those in just a second. So in conclusion, we're thinking here at Duke Restore, we're predicting that scientists, engineers, and society will be able to meet this global call that's now occurring for restoration to come up from the minor to the major leagues and be one of the primary conservation tools that the world looks to when in preserving and managing and bringing back more marine ecosystems. And we expect that this can happen not only in protected areas, which has been this sort of historical paradigm, restore the ecosystems that are going to be protected. But as Avery mentioned, we imagine a world in which we're going to restore and inject nature across a continuum of human activity, from urban marine landscapes to semi-urban marine landscapes to ones that are more pristine. And nature is going to need our help more than ever with increasing climate stress and replenishing the organisms in those systems after they get hit by disturbances, just like we do in forest ecosystems. And so we're hoping here at Duke Restore to work with many, many different entities in the community to help innovate restoration. We've seen 3 different ways we think it's really important. First, positive interactions they happen naturally in nature. They're in every single ecosystem. They're functionally there, and they can amplify restoration success. Importantly, these aren't 5% changes. These are 100, 200, 400% increase in restoration success. That doesn't cost anything. It's just rearranging. And it can change resilience by an order of magnitude. This is not small stuff. There's secondly a big opportunity for nature gains in these novel and hybrid ecosystems. Layering nature right next to our infrastructure, and then taking our infrastructure that we thought was opposed to nature, redesigning it so it facilitates colonization and more organisms there in that environment, spatially orienting them in ways that maximize expected functions and novel ones that Avery talked about. And the third one is inclusivity. And we mean inclusivity in every way possible, intellectually beyond ecologists, expanding to bring in economics, bring in geneticists, bring in policy, bring in engineers, all the different, like in agricultural science. This is where we see restoration science going. Finance is going to be a part of that. Inclusivity with stakeholders. We can no longer do conservation from the top down. It needs to be talking about the people that benefit and need nature locally and at the regional levels. What do they need, and how can we as scientists help provide that? So it's inclusivity at all those different levels. I'll give you an example. Is that, for instance, in helping to bring back fisheries, an ecologist might think about restoring habitat and positive interactions, whereas a community-based social scientist would talk to the people and say, how do we have a common pool resource, how do we work together? So we're thinking about layering those 2 perspectives and restoring nature and in helping community-based conservation, and how that will help restore the fish in those systems. Another example is we're working with industry to scale up seed cultivation and spread. On the left here is an example of work in Australia. It's a collaboration between the Dutch, the Chinese, the Australians, and the Americans in collecting coral larvae when they're spawning in August, and then transplanting those coral larvae hundreds of kilometers to degraded reefs, and then spraying those reefs with coral babies to help recovery in those systems before another disturbance comes up. And this right picture are seeds that have formed there in the seagrasses after a flower has been pollinated. And we're now in the seagrass farm that Stephanie Valdez talked about, scaling that up. So somebody locally who has a dock in North Carolina who would like more seagrasses can come get seeds from the seagrass farm to replenish those areas. So we're going to work with the industry on that. And so thank you very much for your time today. And now we will open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And really awesome set of talks today. I think you spurred a lot of questions in our audience. And I think the first one, I think there was a kind of broad interest in this kind of engagement with the community. Can you talk a little bit more, and maybe specifically you can talk about the project with the marine facility, how you've really engaged the stakeholders in the process of designing and implementing these restoration processes.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you for that question, David Dow. Duke Restore, the envision, and we were inspired by the NGO, non-government organization communities, conservation communities that aren't top down, that work with stakeholders. They bring in the community, all the different partners that are interested in. Try to have conversations. We have conversations about what people need and what nature needs. They need coastal protection. They would like to have these other things like services and carbon sequestration. So we understand the need and we bring everybody together. So for instance, the US Marine Corps is an excellent example. The scientists there at the US Marine Corps reached out to Duke Restore because they heard about this really sort of open initiative that you could form teams in and bring in any professors, students that seem to fit the goal of this project. And then Pew heard about it as well and liked the idea of inclusivity and said, let's get involved. Let's bring everybody together. Who else needs to be involved? We have the Coastal Federation of North Carolina. And it's an open invitation to anybody. And then we have had discussions over the past year, and Carter really bringing forth her data showing that there's not a cost to these living shorelines, there's benefits. It's a win-win situation. Really sold the idea to the US Marine Corps that we could test some ideas there and that a living shoreline could work. Of course, their big priority is coastal protection. So this is our prototype right here, and we like the way it's working, and it's benefiting from inclusivity.
Great. Thanks, Brian. I'd like to ask the audience a question, and I'm going to launch a poll because we're really interested in who joins these conversations. One of the things we've seen in some of the previous webinars is we get a really nice cross-section of people from government, from academics, from the private sector, from nonprofits. And so I'd like to get that same kind of input from this conversation. So please just take a moment to fill out this survey, and there'll be great information for us. Let me open up the conversation. Carter, maybe you could speak a little bit to the question about scalability. Obviously, a big hurdle is to move from the restoration experts to getting more traditional engineers interested and skilled to be able to take these projects to scale. How far are we on that process, and what do you see as the big barriers to overcome?
Yeah, so I think there are sort of two biggest barriers. One is improving our knowledge and our technology for actually employing some of these strategies in the field. So for instance, I think harnessing a lot of these positive species interactions have the potential to help us scale up. As Steph was mentioning, by harnessing some of these biological partnerships, you can reap much higher benefits for no added cost. So incorporating techniques like that is really going to help with scaling things on the ecological side. From more of a community practitioner side, one thing that and by we, I mean the Living Shorelines community collectively, have found to be a challenge in the last decade or so is that there aren't enough people that have the knowledge and the capability to actually build these structures. And so there's been a lot of work that's been done by NGOs and government agencies in North Carolina and all across the US and throughout the world to improve training opportunities to actually teach people how to build these structures and set up an infrastructure so that it's there are financial incentives for people to learn and construct these types of hybrid restoration projects.
Great. So one of the things I think that came through really clearly in the conversations, you guys have great pictures, and the pictures really tell a compelling story. When you see the living shorelines and their ability to, to withstand some of the stresses and, impacts on these systems. Are there any systematic efforts to get a better kind of capture of those before and after settings, which obviously be happening all up and down the coastline? It seems like some more systematic visual documentation of these kinds of efforts could be really powerful part of this selling in of this to people who might be skeptical until they saw those pictures. So I'll just open that up to all of you. If you know of any efforts to do a more kind of systematic documentation of these efforts.
I can kick this off and say, at least on the living shorelines front, we have recognized this as a very, very powerful tool to communicate findings. And so in the last 5 years or so, we have had some grant funding where we've tried to develop series of game cameras that are deployed all over the state to get really good time series photographs of shorelines. A big challenge is most of them don't actually last through these major storm events we're interested in documenting. But something else we're really interested in doing, though I don't have anything I can point people towards right now, is setting up a citizen science initiative where citizens can take repeated pictures of their shorelines so that we can track those over time. And then lastly, I would say, I think drone technology has revolutionized a lot of what we do. And so it's really easy to get super high resolution aerial photographs and then just go back over time and use those to kind of document changes.
Yeah, thanks, Carter. I think that the bar graphs and statistics will get you the publication, but the photographs that are backed up there are going to inspire change and behavioral change in people. It inspires me to, like, that's what I want to do on coastal property. Same with those seagrass and expansions. The drones show managers like that could happen here. That's what I'd like to see happen here. I'll try positive interactions.
Good, and we're coming to the end of our time here. So I'll have one more question, which is about funding. You talked about government and military funding for this. How do you see that evolving in terms of diversity of sources of funding for restoration efforts? And I'll just wrap with that question. There were several other good questions in the Q&A, and we can follow up individually with those, but I'll leave you with that question of funding.
Sure, I'll tackle that. I think it's going to come from non-traditional sources. It's not going to come from the National Science Foundation right now. Those have to be very basic questions, but it's going to come from federal agencies like NOAA, for instance, that has objectives for restoration. It's going to come from private industry. So it's going to be a mix. NGOs that are interested. Right now, we're working with the Nature Conservancy, the Pew Foundation, for instance, and local stakeholders in Coastal Fed, and asking whether or not we could receive a huge carbon stop loss benefit from moisture reefs. So based upon the question and who's interested in benefiting, those are the stakeholders that will probably come to bat and provide. It's going to be a mix of collaborative funding. So there's going to be 5, 6, 7 different sources coming together rather than the traditional of just having one.
And can I just add that I think one of the most interesting potential points for these hybrid restoration strategies is we're not trying to convince people to pay for something that they've never paid for before. We're trying to convince people to pay for restoration instead of traditional gray infrastructure. And so I think there's a whole universe of pathways there for funding this type of restoration.
Great. Well, thank you guys. I think that was a really awesome conversation. There's so much more to talk about here, but let's turn it back to John, who will take us out. And thank you all for being here. And please join us for the next webinar as well. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. And let me just echo you, thanking again all of the speakers for such a fascinating presentation on the frontiers of restoration. So, and thanks mostly to our audience again today too. We had a lot of great questions and a wonderful audience. So thank you so much for joining us here. And just in closing, I hope you'll return next month in November. We're going to have Professor Doug Nowacek and his colleagues speaking on offshore renewable energy and progress in U.S. waters, managing interactions with wildlife. So hope you'll return for that. Please check the Oceans at Duke website for more details on this webinar coming up and future ones, as well as recording of today's webinar that will be up there soon. So thank you again for taking time to listen today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.